Hello and welcome to this 14th day of MIAMAFV, where I examine the decline of motorsports in North America.
It's red panty night when you sign to fight me, yeah?
Have you ever? No, I've never! I'm not surprised, motherfuckers.
I'm gay.
This is a bit of a somber video because I love motorsports. I'm a huge gearhead. I love it with all my heart. I have since I was a little kid, and I used to love listening to the sounds, all the colorful cars painted up in all their sponsors' colors, just running around the track. And as I got older, I understood all the strategy, all the mechanics of everything, how the rules work, and how intricate it is. It's kind of like baseball. The more you know about it, the more interesting it is to watch. But if you don't know anything about it, it just looks like a bunch of assholes going around in circles. Like baseball just looks like, some asshole throwing a ball and some other dude trying to fucking hit it with a stick. But motorsports has been a cornerstone of my life, for as long as I can remember. It's been a cornerstone of American culture basically for the last 100 years, 100 plus years. The first Indy 500 was held in 1911. But if you've been paying attention, even if you aren't really a fan of motorsports, you probably noticed, well, what is IndyCar? I heard about it, 10 or 20 years ago, and now I just hear about the Indy 500 and nothing else. I used to hear about NASCAR a lot, 5-10 years ago, and now it just seems like it's this thing that occasionally pops up on TV. So what exactly happened? This is where I'm going to try to explain how the big three of American motorsports all fell. And they all have very different stories, but they all end up in basically the same place. The big three are, of course, Formula One, which is more of a worldwide sport, but I'm going to get into why that hasn't really taken off over here in America. NASCAR, and then IndyCar will be third. Starting off with Formula One. Formula One is headed by the FIA, but they have been around since 1950. It was basically this almost kind of healing effort after World War II, after, the countries had kind of, for the most part, put themselves back together. They had this touring series that would go from country to country and compete at all these different racetracks. And in the first season of Formula One, the American Grand Prix, well, it wasn't called the American Grand Prix, but the American leg of the tour was the Indy 500. If you ran in the Indy 500, that would count towards your Formula One points, which was pretty interesting at the time. I wish I still did that. That would be awesome. But over the years, Formula One went all over the United States. The biggest draw for the longest time was the road course over in Watkins Glen, New York, which is kind of like in the Finger Lakes region, which is in the western part of the state. And NASCAR and IndyCar still race there, but Formula One stopped going in 1980, and that was really when Formula One kind of started to recede in American culture. If you've ever been to Watkins Glen, you ever watched a race there, the people there are just absolute fanatics. They come from all over the country. As a matter of fact, in the 2017 season, that was the only NASCAR race that sold out. That was the only NASCAR race that had 100,000 plus people show up to it. That's how big this is. This is a big draw, has been for decades, since the 50s, back when they used to race around the town, and then they built the purpose-built road course, I guess because so many people were dying on the streets of Watkins Glen. But anyway, Formula One left Watkins Glen in 1980, and in 1982, they actually held 3 Grand Prix events in America that year, which was then and still is today. America is the only country to hold 3 Formula One races in a single season. They held one in Detroit, one in Dallas, Texas, and another one around Caesar's Palace, the hotel in Las Vegas, which was actually the end cap of the season that year. But after that, the U.S. Grand Prix slowly fades. The Long Beach Grand Prix ends up going to kart, and IndyCar starts running that instead. And a lot of people would say, well, the death knell of the U.S. Grand Prix came in 2005 at the U.S. Grand Prix at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. In kind of a throwback, in the early 2000s, Formula One said they were going to have the U.S. Grand Prix at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Now, they wouldn't be racing on the oval, they'd be racing on the infield road course. But in 2005, there was a tire war, and if you know anything about tire wars in motorsports, that's when 2 competing tire manufacturers start signing contracts with different teams. So, 3 teams might run Goodyear, 4 teams might run Hoosier, and if you're really unlucky, you have have a third tire manufacturer in there. The reason why tire wars aren't that good is because the two competing entities want every edge they can get. They want their tire to be stickier to help the car go faster, but the stickier a tire is, the less reliable it is. It doesn't last as long, and you see some catastrophic tire failures, the stickier and the softer the tire is, but you can go really, really fast. With a harder tire, it doesn't grip as well, but it's not going to have that catastrophic tire failure where the car, blows out the tire and the car flips up into the air and rams in the catch fence and driver ends up dead. You don't want that. So when you have these tire wars, inevitably there's going to be some point where one of the tire manufacturers has a total and complete just clusterfuck. They show up to a racetrack and their tire fails in like 5 laps because they're just trying to get an edge wherever they can, and they end up overextending and they just totally fuck up. That's what happened at the U.S. Grand Prix in 2005. One of the tire manufacturers, I believe it was Michelin, rolled up into Indianapolis with a super soft tire, and coming out of the last turn, which was actually the first turn of the oval track, they kind of run it in reverse, but coming out of the last turn, there was such a high load on the tire, Michelin basically rolled up and said, look, we can't run this the way it is, you guys got to reconfigure the track to put a chicane in here to slow us down, otherwise we're going to have a tire failure. Now Michelin had basically every single team except 3 under their wing, and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the FIA said, we're not going to change the layout of the track because you fucked up. And Michelin tells other teams, well, you guys signed a contract with us, you can't change tire manufacturers now, you guys are just going to have to sit out this race. And so the 2005 U.S. Grand Prix started with 6 cars on the grid, and that was it. People who showed up to that race did not get a refund, they were pissed, and after that, the U.S. Grand Prix, it finished out its contract, I believe it ran until through 2006, and then it was just no more. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway was just like, we cannot have this ever happen again. Fuck you guys, get the fuck out of here. And that basically put the death nail in Formula One, the interest of Formula One in the United States. Now, we do have the Circuit of the Americas out in Austin, Texas, but it's not really taking off the way people had hoped it would. That's because the racetrack was designed by a foreigner. It doesn't look like an American road course. There's a lot of great American road courses. Sonoma, Laguna Seca, Watkins Glen, they could go back there. I mean, hell, Long Beach. I mean, that's a street course. They actually race on the streets of Long Beach, California. But even then, that track's basically been unchanged since the 50s. They could still race there. Those factors combined with the fact that Formula One is very much a foreign entity. Mostly foreign drivers, mostly foreign manufacturers, just foreigners as far as the eye can see. Now, you can say, well, Americans are just xenophobic or whatever, but, we're a patriotic bunch. We like stuff to be made in America by Americans. And so we always kind of had this tentative relationship with Formula One. That and this sort of air of elitism. If you've ever been to a Formula One race, the fans are very much separated from the crews, the pits, the drivers. You may never even see the car with your own eyes until race day when it zooms past you on the track. Compare that with IndyCar and NASCAR, where you can get a pit pass for like dirt cheap, like $50. I paid $40 for them one time, and you can like literally walk up into the pits a few hours before race time is scheduled to go off, before the green flag drops, a few hours before that, and you can walk around the pits, you can touch the tires, the cars are rolling past you going through tech inspection, the crews are there getting everything ready, you can talk to them, you're right there, you can touch and feel all this stuff, you can smell it, you're like literally in the pits where they're going to have pit stops going on here in the next few hours. It's really crazy. Compare that to Formula One, where nothing like that happens whatsoever. You're partitioned off, you're far away from it. It doesn't have a whole lot of fan interaction. So the elitism, the sheer amount of money involved is enough to make your head spin, like millions of dollars. Compare that to, IndyCar and NASCAR teams, which, are operating on weekly budgets of 100,000, maybe a couple 100,000, whereas Formula One is spending, I said millions, it's really like tens of millions, hundreds of millions in most cases. But yeah, that's why Formula One has never really taken off here. I don't think it's going to take off the same way as it has in Europe. Europe has always been more palatable to that sort of culture, being separated, being able to tolerate a level of elitism. I don't think that's really the right word for it, but the idea that, well, maybe that person does know better. Maybe they ought to do whatever they want to do, and I just shouldn't mess with them. That kind of attitude is more palatable in Europe, whereas in America, we're like, fuck you, you ain't no better than me. You know, that's just how we are, I guess. That then leads us to the second leg of the big three, NASCAR. NASCAR has had a very, very long journey. Starting off in the southeast, from Florida, Mississippi, to the hills of North Carolina, starting off in really the late 30s, racing on the beaches of Daytona, and starting off in 1948 at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona, Florida, where NASCAR was officially formed. They started off for just racing on any random track they could. Every dirt track from California to Pennsylvania, anywhere they could. Back in the 50s, they would even, take airports like the Linden Airport in New Jersey. They would shut it down for a little while, and they'd do like a one-day event and run a road course on the airport circuit, which was pretty neat. Actually, a Jaguar ended up winning that race, which was the first foreign manufacturer to win in NASCAR. I think it was back in 1953. But NASCAR doesn't have any sort of mainstream appeal at all. It is definitely a southeastern oddity that occasionally goes out to California, occasionally goes up to New York and Pennsylvania and stuff, but it's definitely a southeastern sport. In 1970s, ABC starts to get involved. I think actually all the way back to the 60s, ABC starts up the Wide World of Sports, and they have some NASCAR races on there. Now these are on a week-long delay, multi-week-long delay, and they didn't put the whole race up on there. It was mostly just the highlights for maybe 30 minutes or an hour. But in 1976, they broadcast the entire Daytona 500, which is a big deal, and ends up being a crazy race with David Pearson and Richard Petty, the two biggest drivers, basically wrecking towards the finish, and David Pearson gets his car restarted and hobbles across the line while Richard Petty's pit crew has to push him across the line, and it's this awesome spectacle. But that was on a delay. In 1979, the perfect storm happens. Literally the perfect storm. A literal storm. In 1979, I believe it was CBS broadcast live for the first time the Daytona 500 in its entirety, flag to flag. The best part was, on the entire East Coast, that February, while the Daytona 500 is happening live, there is a blizzard of just epic proportions. Everybody snowed into their houses, basically from Virginia to Maine. But there's very few power outages. What is there to do about a week or two after the Super Bowl? You're snowed into your house, and there is this oddity on TV, the Daytona 500. And it's a great race. You have Dale Earnhardt leading a bunch of laps. It's his rookie season. Darrell Waltrip, has this great charismatic personality. He's talking on camera, before the race happens and winning a lot of people over. And as the race concludes, on the final lap, Donnie Allison and Cale Yarborough are beating and banging just door to door down the back straight. They got about a mile and a half to go before the race is over, and they both wreck. Richard Petty and Darrell Waltrip race by on the outside. Richard Petty ends up winning, and then the camera goes back to Donnie Allison and Cale Yarborough, who are fighting in the infield. And Donnie Allison's brother, Bobby Allison, also parks his car, gets out, and now he's involved in it. And Bobby Allison has a great line when he's being interviewed after the fact. He says, "I didn't hit him. He insisted on swinging his face into my fist." NASCAR explodes after this. During the 80s, ESPN comes into being. They start broadcasting a lot of NASCAR races. By 1989, the entire season, every single race is being broadcast live, flag to flag. Throughout the 90s, you have just huge growth. Throughout the 2000s, again, huge growth. Bristol Motor Speedway, by the time the 2000s arrive, is selling out at 168,000 people. It's insane how big this is. This is now a national sport. It's definitely still stuck in the southeast. Most of the tracks are there, but they're building new tracks out in Kansas City, in Chicago, out in California, Las Vegas. There's talks of building a short track in New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from Manhattan. There's talks of expanding out to Colorado, to Seattle, building tracks out there or using an existing road course or something. And then by the end of the 2000s, you start seeing a lot of empty seats. you start seeing entire patches of bare aluminum. Bristol Motor Speedway, which used to sell out at 168,000 people, now can only get half that number to show up. What the fuck happened? Well, NASCAR kind of abandoned its roots as they tried to chase this mainstream audience, which I honestly don't think was ever there. I think stock car racing is purely, a southeastern thing. There have been other sanctioning bodies like USAC and ARCA who did stock car racing, and they were out in the Midwest, but they never really took off. They never had the same success that NASCAR did in the Southeast. Throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of NASCAR tracks that had been in the Southeast that had never been big draws start to get shut down. Big developers come in, they buy them out, and they say, we're going to shut down North Wilkesboro Speedway, we're going to shut down Rockingham Speedway, and we're going to take these race dates that they had, and we're going to transfer them over to our big projects we have over in Kansas City and in California and in Las Vegas and in Chicago. Now, those racetracks are total stinkers. People don't like them. The people in the Southeast just don't like them because they're these cookie-cutter mile-and-a-half tracks. They all have the same layout. 14 degrees of banking, tri-oval. The racing there is boring. There's like one groove of racing. Now, California has kind of become this really good racetrack as of late now that the pavement's gotten old and, it's really hard to drive on. You can see guys slipping and sliding all over the place. But Kansas, Chicago, Las Vegas, I never liked those tracks. I never did. And other tracks like Loudon, New Hampshire, I know it's been on the schedule for a long time, but at the same time, man, that track should have never had 2 dates. It's boring. Dover International Speedway is boring. Pocono up in Pennsylvania, it's been there for a long time. It's a great racetrack, but at the same time, you're holding the race in the summer when it rains all the goddamn time. The race gets rained out and shit. You gotta change up the schedule, and NASCAR changes up the schedule in basically every single worst way possible. Combine that with the inconsistency and the bullshit that NASCAR keeps spewing every time a driver talks ill of the sanction body and a driver says, well, I don't like what NASCAR's doing here. NASCAR fines them. Like literally would fine them tens of thousands of dollars. And people didn't like that. They changed the car to the so-called Car of Tomorrow in 2007 and 2008. It looks ugly. Nobody likes it. By the time they changed that up in 2013 to the Gen 6 car, the damage is done. Daytona has tore down its backstretch grandstands, which used to sell out because they can't sell a single seat over there anymore. Talladega and Charlotte do the same. Charlotte used to hold 100,000 people. Now it holds something like 60,000. You see tracks where you used to not see a single piece of aluminum. You would just see like t-shirts all over the stands, of everybody's favorite driver and all that. Now you just see like half the seats are empty. You used to get 100,000 people. Now you're lucky if you get 50,000. NASCAR turned its back on its core audience, trying to chase a mainstream audience that was never fucking there. It was run poorly. Brian France basically changes up the rules every single year since 2004. Used to, it was you would race all the races in a season, 36 races. The higher you finished, the more points you got. Whoever had the most points at the end of the season was the champion. Now, of course, this would lead some people who just had really dominant seasons to basically lock up the championship with 2 or 3 races remaining in the season. And you also have the last time they ran this format in 2003, Matt Kenseth only won 1 race and became champion and locked it up with, I think, a race or 2 left to go in the season. NASCAR was like, no, we're not doing that anymore. They introduced the chase, which is basically we take the top 10 drivers in the last 10 races and we reset the points. And then whoever gets the most points in those last 10 races is champion. Now that seems convoluted, right? Well, they make it 16 drivers, 12 they say, well, we're going to change up how we divvy up points during this time. Then they introduce like the knockout style where we'll do 3 races and we'll eliminate 4 drivers and we'll do 3 more and eliminate more drivers. And now it's just convoluted as fuck. You introduce stage racing and nobody knows what the fucking rules are anymore. I have a hard time keeping track of all the rules in my head. Now imagine somebody who doesn't know anything about NASCAR, hasn't been keeping track of it for the last 20 years like I have, and have them try to figure out what the fuck's going on. It's a shit show. It's being poorly managed. A lot of the races are stinkers. A lot of the racetracks aren't what they should be. But by and large, I would say the show, the racing that's been going on, is better than it was in the 90s. Back in the 90s, it was common to have races go caution-free, flag to flag, have a guy lead every single lap of the race and just run away with it. That rarely happens anymore. As a matter of fact, we haven't had a caution-free race since 2001. Nobody's led every single lap of an event since 2000. Back during the 80s, they used to measure margins of victory in laps or minutes, and now, it's seconds. The shows overall are better than they ever have been. Yeah, you got some tracks that aren't that interesting, but, you got 36 races out of the season, and you only have really 6 to complain about. That's not too bad, but it's everything else around it that has really fucked it up. Now, let's switch gears, no pun intended, to the final leg of our examination of the decline of the big three of American motorsports, IndyCar. Whereas Formula One has problems adjusting to American culture and has problems with this air of elitism, and NASCAR has so many, just a litany of problems that have plagued it for so long, it's hard to find one root cause, even if there is one. But with IndyCar, we can basically point towards one colossally dumb decision made in 1996 that basically initiated their path to complete and total irrelevance. And that was the CART-IndyCar split of 1996. Let's go ahead and give you the setup. IndyCar racing is basically an open cockpit, open wheel form of racing that is done mostly in America. They have some ventures into Mexico and into Canada, but it is by and large an American racing series that has its focal point as the Indy 500 held in May. The sanctioning body for IndyCar racing from the 70s all the way up until 1996 is CART, Championship Auto Racing Teams. That's what it stands for. In 1994, the owner of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Tony George, announces his formation of the Indy Racing League and a copyright on the term IndyCar, because IndyCar is a direct reference to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Now, CART has no claim on IndyCar as a namesake, nor do they have anything to do with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. They don't have any stake in it other than it is part of their schedule. They don't have any say in the actual operations of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. They just race there, and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway hosts them. When Tony George announces the formation of the Indy Racing League in 1994, he basically says, yes, I'm going to make a competing open wheel racing league to CART, and our debut season is going to be in 1996. Since Tony George owns all the rights to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway as well as the Indy 500, he can basically dictate what type of car can and cannot race in the Indy 500, and CART just can't do anything about it other than not show up. But this is the Indy 500. We're talking about 250,000 people showing up in the stands to watch this race. Untold millions at home watching on TV. It's a big deal. You can't just, take your ball and go home from that. Throughout 1994 and 1995, Tony George keeps manipulating the rules of the Indianapolis 500, saying that your engine can only be so big, it has to be made this way, and Penske, who is the biggest kart team, and Ganassi, the second biggest kart team, and a lot of other ones, are pissed. They're like, you can't keep changing these fucking rules on us. We're making these engines trying to run at Indy in 1995 and 1996, and you keep changing the rules, and now we have all these fucking engine blocks that are fucking useless, and we spent millions of dollars developing these goddamn things. So the tension there is huge. There is just this growing animosity between the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and CART. 1996 rolls in, and the Indianapolis 500 that year is supposed to be a concurrent event between CART and the IRL. They are supposed to compete together in this one race, and then they go about their separate ways in their own schedules. But this is like basically the Super Bowl between these two sporting organizations. But Tony George announces that he will reserve 25 of the 33 starting spots for IRL teams. The people at CART fucking lose it. They say, you're only going to let 8 of us fucking compete? We got more than 33 teams just on our side. You don't even have 25 IRL teams. How are you even going to be able to fill out the field? You can't tell us that only 8 of our guys are going to be able to compete. This is part of our schedule. We can't just have one race where only 8 guys are making points. This completely fucks up our schedule. What the fuck are you doing? It is a colossally dumb decision, and how it is handled by both sides is just a textbook case of how to run 2 series straight into the fucking ground. Tony George doesn't back down at all, and the reason why he doesn't is this is a power play. He thinks he can leverage the history of the Indy 500 as big as it is and use that to basically make CART bow to his will, and he hopes it will merge with the IRL, and then he will be basically the sole proprietor of American open wheel racing. CART doesn't come to the table. They fight him tooth and nail. In 1996, they announce they will race their own version of the 500 over at Michigan International Speedway. They'll call it the US 500. They will race it basically at the exact same time as the Indy 500. The fans are split 50-50. The people who rent out hotels in Indianapolis say, yeah, we're getting like half as much business as we used to. The people who sell tickets are like, yeah, we used to have 100,000 people show up for qualifying. Now we got like 20, 50,000. And bear in mind, CART is the biggest open wheel racing series in America. All the talent is there. All the money is there. The IRL is basically a cost saving measure. Tony George bills it as the affordable option compared to CART. And this split has the fans just irate with each other and the teams and Tony George. There's a lot of people, probably about 100,000, that defect over to the US 500 and go watch that instead. And CART has just an abysmal failure of a race. On the pace lap, Jimmy Vasser has an accident and takes out half the field before the green flag even flies. And then CART says, shit, okay, well, break out your backup cars and you'll run those instead. The guys who are undamaged from the initial accident say, you can't fucking do that. Are they going to go through tech inspection? Are you going to inspect these cars to make sure that they're legal? There's a big minutia about that. The race is basically delayed for an hour and a half, and by the time that whole shit show gets figured out, Buddy Lazier has won the Indy 500 for the people who are still watching that. The US 500 finally kicks off. It's kind of a boring race. It's not all that great. People leave Michigan International Speedway with a sour taste in their mouths, and that is not the end of CART's struggles. Throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, they have a lot of drivers get killed. Big stars get killed because these cars are just going so fast, and CART doesn't really want to slow them down. That's like their draw over IndyCar is these cars are faster, better drivers, better teams, more money, bigger, better, faster, all that shit. They don't want to slow them down, and now they're starting to lose drivers to these races that are having, 240 mile an hour speeds. They have a race scheduled in Texas. IndyCar says they were going to race in Texas, and they still do today. But CART's going to also compete at Texas. It's going to have a competing race many weeks after the IndyCar race, and they're going to have a big draw at Texas too. Well, they show up there, and since these cars are way, way faster, a lot of the drivers start to say, well, these high G's over here, I'm starting to feel dizzy. One driver says, I almost passed out, and then the race gets canceled. Tens of thousands of people showing up trying to buy tickets, and yeah, the race is canceled. And apparently CART didn't really spread the news of this all that well, because there were thousands of people who showed up to the racetrack on race day only to be told that there was no race going on that day. That's an abysmal failure. Early 2000s, start to round out. CART's gone bankrupt. They reform as Champ Car. They go bankrupt at the end of the 2007 season, and all during this time, the IRL isn't doing much better. They have a race at Charlotte where shit flies out into the stands. I think it was a tire and kills 3 spectators. That is not the only time that happens. You cannot have races going on where spectators are getting killed. That's just awful. They have their own drivers getting killed. It's just kind of everything that could have gone wrong during this time period goes wrong. The two finally merge in 2008 when the IRL buys up all the assets of CART, or at that point was called Champ Car. And since then, the IndyCar series has just been slowly declining over time. time. They haven't ever gained back anything. And like I said before, you can all trace this back to that one colossally dumb decision by Tony George. You can lay it all at his feet. When he said, I'm only going to let 8 competing cars go up against my guys in my series, that was basically, the die had been cast at that point. It was over. And there was no better benefactor from all of this than NASCAR. Going into the 90s, IndyCar racing through kart, that was the pinnacle of American motorsports. NASCAR didn't overtake kart and IndyCar until the mid-1990s. And then they had this huge surge. And here's another thing that I don't think gets mentioned enough. If you look at the early IRL schedule from 1996, 97, 98, a lot of those racetracks are NASCAR-sanctioned tracks. At any point in time, NASCAR could have said, no, you're a competing series. We're not going to let you compete on our tracks. Fuck off. But they didn't. They said, oh, new IRL. You guys are competing against kart. Come on, we'll give you a place to race. I remember being at Charlotte Motor Speedway in 1997 for the All-Star race. At the time it was called the Winston Select. And I remember being at that race and they debuted an IRL car. And I remember that fucker was loud. But I also remember thinking to myself, why is NASCAR debuting a competing racing series at their track? That's weird, right? But of course, this debut was exactly what NASCAR wanted. They wanted to drive a wedge in between kart and the IRL because they knew, hey, all these fans are going to get disillusioned. Well, we have a unified racing series right over here. And remember that thing I said about Formula One, about how it was all foreign drivers and foreign manufacturers? Well, by 1996, kart was mostly foreign drivers and a lot of foreign engine manufacturers. It wasn't American anymore. But NASCAR, that was all American. NASCAR basically dug the grave of American open wheel racing and then danced upon it afterwards. I honestly think that's what happened. But now that NASCAR has its own problems, who really has the last laugh here? I don't think anybody does. I think we're just kind of in this death spiral right now, and we're just waiting for a moment where we can all stabilize out and hopefully everything will be back on an even keel. Another cool thing is, as these racing series shrink, they do reach out to their fans a lot more. They go back to their roots. IndyCar went back to Phoenix Raceway. They're still competing at Texas. NASCAR definitely seems like they're trying to kind of revert back to their roots. There's a lot of talk about going back to Rockingham and other tracks like that were left in the dust back during the 90s and the early 2000s. I don't think they're going to abandon Kansas and Chicago and California because they have way too much money invested in those tracks. But, time will tell. And I can guarantee you right now, the NFL and NASCAR, as they continue to have receding TV ratings, they're taking a good, long, hard look at IndyCar and the Indy 500, which, by the way, the Indy 500, the last 2 years, has had 300,000 plus people show up to it. The Indy 500 holds up IndyCar racing because they're not getting big crowds at any other racetrack except Indy. That is the one event that is holding that entire sanctioning body up. NFL or NASCAR are looking, it's like, hey, can we hold up our entire series based on one event? Can it be carried on the back of the Super Bowl? Can it be carried on the back of the Daytona 500? It's an honest question, and you can bet your bottom dollar they are taking a good, long, hard look at that, because if the NFL continues to go down the tubes the way it is, it's going to start looking like IndyCar, where, the Super Bowl is still this American institution, but everything else is just kind of meh, just by the wayside, who cares? But that is my take on the decline of American motorsports, or North American motorsports, in particular the big three. Formula One, too many foreigners, too elitist, too detached from American culture. NASCAR, left American culture trying to chase a mainstream audience that was never there, trying desperately to make the show more interesting, even though I don't think that's really the problem. Kept changing the rules and making it really hard to follow. And then IndyCar with the kart IRL split of 1996. That was the nail in their coffin. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this little automotive motorsports history lesson from me. I'll be back tomorrow with another video. I hope you enjoy that one. Take it easy.